So, hello everyone, and welcome to the second lesson for this online humanities course. So what we're going to talk about today is the Enlightenment, and we'll be talking about mostly Enlightenment ideology, Enlightenment ideas, the history surrounding the causes of the Enlightenment, and we'll be looking at some works of art that express Enlightenment ideology in one way or another. So let's get started then. So for part one, we're going to look to the historical causes. Here we have a portrait of Sir Isaac Newton, who, although not an Enlightenment figure per se, sort of precedes that. He certainly was behind many of the causes that lead to the Enlightenment in many ways. So the Enlightenment is approximately 1650 to about 1789. It's also called the Age of Reason. It's both an historical movement, so it's a movement that occurs within history, and coupled with this movement there are a set of ideas and an aesthetic and a culture that arises with it. One of the main elements of the Enlightenment is its emphasis upon the power of the human mind, the authority even of the human mind, of human reason in particular, not just the mind or consciousness, but human reason, thinking and independent thinking, to liberate the individual and to improve society. So from that perspective, a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers will emphasize and they'll encourage individualism and critical thinking. When you read, for example, Kant's work on what is enlightenment, which is tied to this assignment, you'll see that he basically says, well, the Enlightenment has something to do with independent thinking and indeed the courage to think on one's own. So this is a very important point that he brings up. It's expressed also in the Enlightenment motto, which you'll find in that same text by Kant, which is sapere aude, which means have the courage to think on your own. So one of the interesting aspects of the Enlightenment is it's a historical movement and set of ideas. So that means a set of ideas would be a certain theoretical set of notions that people followed, but as a historical movement, it means that these people attempted to put these ideas into practice, and indeed much of the Enlightenment ideology would eventually lead into a new age of revolution, which we see, for example, in 1789 within France. We have the French Revolution, and in 1775 or 76 within America we have the American Revolution. So these later revolutions will be spurred on by a lot of this Enlightenment ideology, and a lot of the primary texts that we see, like the U.S. Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, a lot of these ideas will be formulated within the Enlightenment. And of course, it finds a deep history within the Western intellectual tradition. So, as I said, it's going to lead to a lot of large, wide-scale change and revolution within both Europe and in America. So, just a bit of historical context for understanding the Enlightenment. So, the Enlightenment thinking is really going to be reactionary in many ways, and it's going to be reactionary against the social, political backdrop of the European system, in place during that time, as well as in America, because America at that time is going to be consist of colonies ruled by the British Empire. And so we can kind of boil this down. Now, this is just a very short summary of a large history, but we can boil it down to three fundamental practices during the pre-Enlightenment era, which the Enlightenment thinkers and actors, historical actors, will kind of rebel against. The first is the establishment of a form of monarchical rule. So in other words, a rule by a king and a queen, by lords and nobles and princes. And basically, it's a rule based upon family lineage, where we have the next generation is going to inherit the throne, inherit power, based upon their family rule, based upon blood. So you have to think about what kind of social ideology supports that system. It's an ideology which sees distinctions, okay, among individuals based upon their family lineage, right? So that's a very different ideology from what we see today, for example, in a democratic state, where all individuals are considered equal. That idea is an Enlightenment era idea. Okay, so tied to this monarchical rule is going to be the unity, okay, the non-separation of church and state, and this is going to be something which is placed in practice. Okay, so the establishment of the monarchies, many of which, or the empires and emperors in Europe, many of which were seen as a divine right, okay, rooted in God and the Catholic Church. And indeed, many of the kings were, in fact, crowned by the Pope, okay, kind of sealed their seat as the rightful rulers of the country, whether that be France or Britain or etc. And we see also that theological systems based upon, for example, a great chain of being were established. Now, a chain of being would be something like, well, God is the highest, the most perfect being, and from God we have something like the angels, which are near perfect, but not quite perfect. They're just purely immaterial beings. And then we have human beings, for example, which consist of both form, a spiritual part, and matter, the body, right? And among human beings, we can then establish a social order where we have the king is kind of the highest within the chain of human beings, and then we have the nobles, and then maybe we have the priestly caste, and then maybe we have the working class. And so you see there's this separation of classes, which brings us to the third point, which sees human beings, human individuals, as sharply delineated into hierarchical class systems, so that at the very lowest point we have, of course, what you find would be slavery. In the practice of slavery, human beings who are seen as not having the right to conduct their own free choices, right? So this class inequality is expressed later on within the 16th century through the practice of serfdom, which is a form of bondage, a kind of slavery, it's a bit different, in which laborers are going to be tied to a plot of land in the service of a noble lord. Okay, this comes out of the earlier medieval feudal system, which was still in practice within the 16th and 17th century, where we have individuals who are forced to work on a plot of land, much like slaves, although in some ways they kind of own the land, so it's a bit different. So now one of the larger problems of the time is then going to be about land ownership. Okay, in present times we have a slightly different problem. It's not so much about land ownership, it's about wealth ownership. So, but let's look at the historical setting. We see that 97% of the population of the time, think about that, 97%. So if we had, let's say, 1 million people, that would mean that 970,000 people, okay, owned less than 40% of the land, which means that 300,000 people owned 60% or more of the land itself. So there's deep inequality. And of course, in present times, we see, which is very interesting, this type of class inequality is actually greater because we have something like most of the wealth of the world is owned by something like 10% of the population. Okay, so this looks like this was cut off here. Here we have few possibilities available for upward or downward movement along the scale. A peasant was not allowed within, for example, the noble classes. When we read Goethe's book, The Sorrows of Young Werther, we're going to see this kind of interesting class inequality in terms of Werther's encounter with the higher aristocratic classes, and he's going to be embarrassed when he goes to a party because the noble individuals will see him as coming from a lower class, and in fact they won't want him to be there, so that the individual, the lord who invited him, who happened to be a nice fellow, in the end is forced to ask him to leave. So we're going to see that within the novel itself. Right? So here we have some historical context. Now let's look at some particular, more specific causes of the Enlightenment itself. Now, the Enlightenment you have to think of as first an ideology. It's a new way of thinking. It's a new way of thinking that leads to great and large-scale changes and revolutions within Europe. For something like that to take place, it's necessary that there be social and economic conditions and factors that play into it. Because you can have certainly isolated, let's say, Enlightenment thinkers out on a farm somewhere, out in some rural area or in a monastery, okay, thinking up very interesting ideas, but unless there's some communication between individuals, these ideas are not going to spread. So one of the fundamental points within the 16th, 17th, and to the 19th century is that you're going to see the communication of these ideas, and for this to happen, you need something like more food available, you need increasing population, and you need something like the Industrial Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution, which we're going to talk about now. So first we have the Agricultural Revolution. Now this revolution is going to be the result of innovations that take place principally at first, that is, in England at the time between around the 1750 and the 19th century. And mainly what we're going to see is improvements in farming techniques. So one way to think about how this leads to wide-scale change, okay, certainly more people are going to now have food available, is to think about the use of pesticides today. So pesticides and fertilizer as well. So pesticides and fertilizer. Because of pesticides and fertilizers, we can then, okay, keep away a lot of the bugs from the plants, and we can also produce more. And also new farming techniques today, hydroponic farming, for example, allow us to produce different types of crops during different types of seasons. So we have a lot more food, and this leads to a larger increase in the population. So some of the innovations at the time were something like the iron plow, which you see over in the lower left corner, and right there. And we see also something like the reaper, think of the Grim Reaper, right, going around. So this made farming a lot easier, and so farmers were able to produce more, and the increased food inevitably means that families have more food on their plate, and they can have more children, and their children can have more children, and so this leads to a population boom. And when you have a population boom, of course, now people are going to be communicating, they're going to be moving from the rural villages into cities, and cities are going to increase. And once you start to get this increase in population, education will improve, okay, and people will start communicating, right? So the second we have here is the scientific revolution, which is why I had the picture of Newton from before. And this began with earlier developments within the medieval times, which lead into the Enlightenment times, with developments in the sciences, in the empirical and formal sciences, right? So mathematics, and then the empirical sciences such as astronomy, mechanics, chemistry, and biology. Now, with the scientific revolution, okay, this leads not only to, certainly to new technology, okay, it leads also to a certain belief among individuals within society that, well, look, we can kind of describe the laws of nature, and in describing the laws of nature, we can also harness its power. And so this leads to a belief among individuals and among societies, and of course scientific societies and philosophical, etc., that, well, the human being has a certain power and control over nature, and it's a power and control which is in many ways not given to us by a higher authority, but established by a very human practice, the scientific practice, okay? And much of the ideas of the scientific practice will come a little bit earlier out of such thinkers as Francis Bacon and his Novum Organum, who begins to establish something like, well, what scientific practice should be, okay? And this involves an emphasis upon observation and experiment. So if you go back all the way to the Greek philosophers, to ancient Greece, you see that there were in fact scientists of the time, okay, Archimedes, for example, okay, who developed various machines. There were astronomers, but there was not this very clear scientific method where we should be observing and testing the world. This idea starts to come out really in the 15th and 16th century, and it was really such individuals as Isaac Newton and Galileo Galilei who really start to put these ideas, these new ideas about scientific method, into practice. So we see on the right there is a telescope, which Galileo himself invented. And of course, Isaac Newton kind of single-handedly brought mechanics into a full-blown science. Okay? So with the scientific revolution, this leads to Enlightenment ideas that the human being has the ability to control their world, to control their destiny. That's very important, especially when you consider this class-based system where peasants are forced to work the land. Suddenly people are starting to get more educated and to say, wait a minute, we can control our destiny, especially through science. We don't need the king, we don't need the pope to tell us how to live and what we can do. So this new individualism starts to develop along with science and this belief in the authority of the human being over nature. So the third aspect is of course, the Industrial Revolution, which also largely begins in England and then kind of moves off into the other European states and into America. And what we see here is the substitution, especially of machines, okay, for manual labor. We have factory systems, for example, the replacement of animal and human power with new sources of energy such as water and steam. The steam engine, for example, was patented by James Watt in 1769, which transforms the generation of power. And we have the introduction of new resources and raw materials, such as iron ore and coal. Okay, so with the Industrial Revolution, okay, this is also going to lead to more possibilities for communication, greater increases in the city. Okay, people are going to be able to travel a bit more, and so you have contact and ideas are going to spread. So it leads to a realigned, and one of the more important aspects is that it begins to change the class social order. Why? Because now you have factories, and these factories are being run by these capitalists, okay? There's workers, these workers now coming from the farms to work in the factories, and so you get this new social order between these capitalist, factory industrialist owners and the workers, the laborers in the factories today. It's a class order which we in fact experience and live by to a certain extent today. So it transforms the social order, and so it leads to new indicators of wealth and success. Now it's not so much that we have to move up into an impassable, noble society, but hey, maybe we can actually move into a factory and move up and begin and open our own factory one day, or our own business at some point, okay? And so we have new patterns of class behavior that begin to evolve out of this era. So just a few interesting ideas that begin to develop, because we see that it's also the Enlightenment ideals that start to affect people's attitudes. We have within economics new changes as well. And here I'm just going to go over a few of them. There's the three classical economists. Okay? The first is Adam Smith, who is usually called the father of capitalism. And he develops new ideas about economics in his Wealth of Nations. One of the main things that he argues against within that book, that work, which is a great work, which everyone should take the time at some point to read, is he argues against government control of the markets. At the time, this is called mercantilism, it was a form of government control which is much greater than we can imagine today. Okay? Certainly the interference today is nothing like what they had then. And his basic point was the market needs competition in order to thrive. If the government's interfering, then we're not going to have competition. Why? Because competition fuels supply and demand, and it leads to increase in possibilities within the markets and an increase in greater technology. And he says that self-interest, of course, because we're all working within businesses, for example, for ourselves, well, self-interest can actually lead to the common good, as we see, because, well, when businesses attempt to make better products, we receive those products, and in many ways they can improve our lives, especially if you look at something like medical technology. And so we have, he quotes the expression laissez-faire, let it be, allow the market forces to operate on their own. The next one we have is Thomas Malthus, and he writes a very interesting essay on the principle of population. Okay, so a lot of these things, I want you to keep them in mind. Remember to always take notes on these lectures, okay, as we're going along. You can always review the videos, but you should also be taking notes as though you were in a classroom. So he argues that it's basically one of the important things to do as population increases is to be careful. And we should try to limit population growth as much as possible. We see the effects of this, for example, in China and India today. Why is that? So what he basically argues is that population growth will increase at a geometric rate, so it's almost going to be exponential. On the other hand, food supply growth will increase at an arithmetical rate, so something more linear, right? So what does that mean? Is that as the number of human beings increases, the food availability will not meet that, so that people are going to starve to death. And so his basic argument within the book is we should therefore be watching out how many people we have within our country, and we should limit that population to the extent that's possible if it exceeds our ability to fuel it, right? So the last one then is David Ricardo, who has his principles of political economy. And there he offers his iron law of wages, which is a very unfortunate but true law about the economic conditions within capitalist societies. And his basic idea, according to this law, is that a laborer's wage will hover around subsistence level. Why? The reason is that if you're looking at a business is trying to constantly increase revenue or profit. Okay? Now that means that you want to pay your workers as little as possible in order to maintain your profits. And so that will mean that even as profits increase, the wages of laborers will never quite reach that equitable level. And especially in certain conditions, you look at these large conglomerates such as Walmart and Burger King, etc., you see that the laborers are paid subsistence level wages even today. Okay, so the result of this is that workers will be unable to improve their standard of living beyond the subsistence level, and that the working class is going to be, as we see today, inevitably mired in poverty. So these are very interesting economical ideas that come out of this time, which in many ways are truths that apply to even to our present time. Very sad. Okay, so the next cause we have is intellectual, and we have major thinkers such as essayists, political essayists, and philosophers, and authors who begin to profess new ideas about the human being. So they start to talk about the natural dignity of the human being. In other words, the idea that the human being by nature is good and each human being is equal to another. They talk about social and political liberty, that basically as human beings, we're not born into slavery. This is an unnatural condition. we're born into equal conditions, and it's really social distinctions which begin to sometimes establish these inequalities. Okay, and so this leads to something like the notion of equality of classes, and a lot of ideas about religious freedom and tolerance also come out of this age. Okay, although as you're going to see when you look at the French Revolution, that the French Revolution will kind of attack a lot of religious ideology, seeing it as somehow backward and dangerous. But in any case, a lot of these ideals will influence the American and French revolutions. When you read, for example, the Bill of Rights, and you read, for example, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, well, the Bill of Rights comes from the U.S. Constitution, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen comes from the French Revolution. Both express basic ideas about freedom, equality, and the pursuit of happiness that come from the Enlightenment and apply even today. So some Enlightenment thinkers, we have John Locke, okay, who was a British thinker. He writes his second treatise of civil government. There he argues that the human being, okay, basically has the right to own property. We all have the right to own property, and we have the right to be free, right? We have the right to life. We have the right to be prosecuted civilly and justly within a civil court, okay? We have the Baron de Montesquieu, who writes A Spirit of Laws, and there we see the first initial, more clear, because these ideas come from ancient thought as well. He argues for the separation of powers of the state into the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, which would obviously influence, okay, the founding fathers of the U.S. Constitution, who do the same. Okay, we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who writes his Social Contract, and there he argues for the natural liberty and equality of the human being. So the basic idea about the social contract, or what's called contract theory, is that originally human beings live in a kind of primitive state where stronger human beings have authority over less strong human beings. And eventually this becomes kind of irritating, especially for certain groups of families who wish to live in a more peaceful environment. And so what they do is they find other groups and other families, and they say, hey, why don't we gather together and agree not to war against each other, but in fact, let's agree instead to protect one another against other outside invaders, and therefore establish peace and harmony. And according to contract theory, this original contract, right, where we say let's not fight together, let's work together, is the founding basis of a state, of how states begin to form. Okay, so notice there that it's not, the founding of a state is not, well, we have this monarch who now is our leader, right? The founding of the state is that, well, as natural human beings, we agree to gather together and form a society. So very different Enlightenment ideology there. And then, of course, we have Immanuel Kant in his What is Enlightenment, which you'll be reading as well. And he argues for the independence of reason and the courage to pursue the truth. The expression which you'll find in that reading is sapere aude, have the courage to think on one's own. So let's go to part 2. Throughout these lessons, I'll be going over some art, because it gives us a visual context for understanding some of the social, political, and philosophical and historical ideas. Kind of like watching a movie, okay, based around a book that you may have read. Somehow watching the art gives us a kind of different context and helps us to understand. So here we have Neoclassical Art, which is kind of the art of the Enlightenment, and here's an example of Neoclassical art by Jacques-Louis David, one of the great neoclassical painters. And here we have the Emperor Napoleon in his study. So here we have neoclassicism, and we see that the Enlightenment gives birth to neoclassicism in the sense that it's a kind of revival of the classical style of ancient Greece and Rome. So you can think about, for example, the Colosseum of Rome, or think about the ancient Greek temples and their large columns. Well, somehow this is kind of a neoclassical style, so it's kind of what you'd have in mind when you think about ancient Greek and Roman art. One of the interesting points to keep in mind when you read Kandinsky, Vasily Kandinsky's on the spiritual in art later, is he talks about imitative art, right? Well, with the neoclassical style, it's not so much imitative, and the reason is that, well, within the Enlightenment thinkers simply felt a kind of sympathy with the ancient Greek and Roman classical style, and indeed they revived it and didn't imitate because they made it their own. Kandinsky will talk about that too. He'll talk about styles which can be revived as opposed to imitated. Well, with the neoclassical style, it's definitely a revival. Okay? So this style later becomes the initial art of the French Revolution, after which it becomes more of a romantic art, which we'll talk about later. Neoclassicism emphasizes the beauty, grandeur, dignity, I should add, and ideal form of nature and humanity, which is basically the Enlightenment ideals of the human being as kind of standing on its own, okay, without a divinity above its head, but rather seeing itself as a kind of authority, and seeing reason as the authority, and science as the authority. Okay, and it's seen in art, literature, and poetry. So here's another painting by David. We have the Oath of the Horatii. Notice here that, and you can read this on your own at some other point, that the image is, what David is using here is an image from an old historical scene within Roman times, and you see that they're wearing Roman gear, etc. So this is painted in, of course, in 1784-85, and people didn't dress like that. Okay, so but it's used as a symbol to express certain ideals. Okay, and indeed it's the ideal of liberty and reason. And the Horatii, the three brothers, they swore an oath to defend Rome even at the cost of their lives. So the painting is something to do about maintaining one's integrity. Right? Okay. Here we have another example when you read and when you watch the clip, the movie that's associated with this, the documentary rather, on the French Revolution. You'll see they talk about this painting. This is Jacques-Louis David again, the death of Marat, and here you can see that Marat, who with the documentary is seen as a rather unsavory, bloodthirsty individual. He's painted here almost like a kind of hero in a way. And you see this becomes kind of the backdrop of the French Revolution, which later comes from the Enlightenment, where we see that individuals and revolutionaries are extolled, okay, as kind of the heroes and indeed the gods of the day. Okay. Another one from David, and this is Napoleon at Saint Bernard Pass. Okay, and we see here it's the image of Napoleon crossing the Alps, and it's within the tradition of a Roman equestrian portraits. What you want to notice here is the grandeur of the painting. This is kind of what neoclassical style is about. That the images are very grand. You'll notice that there's an aspect of a realistic aspect to the portrait. In other words, the colors are kind of what the colors would actually look like. You see Napoleon, and he looks like Napoleon would have looked like. This is important because when we look at later painting, romantic styles, and impressionism, and as we move into modern styles of abstractionism, we're going to see that all that kind of realism begins to fade away as artists begin to focus on other aspects of the nature of art. Okay, here we have another painter, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang. You should really see a painting like this in a museum. I've seen, in fact, Ang's paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and they are absolutely magnificent. It simply doesn't capture the painting here on the screen because when you look at the painting, in an actual museum, you see that, for example, the gold on his shirt and the gold around the chair, it glistens off the painting. And the silver too. It's quite remarkable, and the realism with which he depicts Napoleon there. I mean, really, it's a photograph, okay, which he has basically painted without using the photograph, and it's masterful. And obviously, when you look at the picture, you see it paints the grandeur of Napoleon in this great neoclassical style. So another example of neoclassical art. And here we have another one from the same painter. It's the Grand Odalisque. Okay. This is another example of neoclassical art. One of the interesting things to note here is notice how the body of the woman is slightly elongated. That's very interesting. Because if you look at, for example, magazines, fashion magazines today, you see the models, they often elongate the models. And you see, well, interestingly, these ideas of beauty have a very deep history that go beyond our own times. And in fact, fashion, people who are in fashion, and we see here this painter, have long been kind of manipulating the form. There was even a movement in art, okay, during that time, a little earlier, called Mannerism, in which all the forms were kind of elongated. Well, in fact, when you look at fashion today, Mannerism is in practice, right? So this is another example of neoclassical art. Now we have another one from Ong of Oedipus and the Sphinx, and again, neoclassical style. Here he's capturing a Greek scene within myth. Now, the painting depicts Oedipus, this is a very interesting myth, meeting the Sphinx at the crossroads on his journey between Thebes and Delphi, and Oedipus must answer the Sphinx's riddle correctly in order to pass. And failure means his own death and that of the besieged Thebans. And here's the riddle. What walks on 4 feet in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 at night? Right? And the answer is a man, a human being. Why? Because in the morning we're children, we crawl. In the afternoon we're adults and we walk. And in the evening we're old, unfortunately, and we use a cane. Part 3. So now we turn to Enlightenment philosophy. And for this I've chosen Descartes' Meditation on First Philosophy for a number of reasons. Rene Descartes is a very famous philosopher and mathematician within the tradition. His work, the Meditations on First Philosophy, in many ways kind of brings on the Enlightenment within philosophical thinking. It's a very accessible text. It's easy to read on your own, although I'll be going through parts of it here. In summary, I think it should be very accessible to you, and you should be able to understand the basic ideas behind the text, along with the reading questions and projects that we'll be doing. So the work deals with issues of the existence of the self, God, the world, reality, appearance, truth, and falsity. And the underlying idea of the work is that the human being can achieve truth on their own standing, just through thinking on our own. Without the appeal of faith, we can achieve truth. And this is a very important distinction, which really makes the work an Enlightenment text. And indeed, it stands to contrast older medieval views where truth was seen as the possession of the church. Okay, so just as a note, I'm just going to be summarizing again these texts here. Make sure you read carefully and reflect upon the texts, as this is part of your task in the online course. So before we turn to Descartes' meditation itself, I'm going to go through his little discourse on method, just to give you an example of the kind of methodology of humanities, and you'll see that he applies some of those methods that we talked about in the first lesson. So the first step which he suggests for his method of thinking, and you'll see it's the first step that he takes within his meditations, is to accept only clear and distinct judgments. And so this is kind of his method of doubt, or suspension of judgment. the basic idea there is that we have a lot of beliefs that are kind of floating around in our heads for which we really have no justification. So I might believe, for example, that tomorrow is going to come. I believe in God, or I believe in many other things, and maybe I don't really have a rationalization for why I believe these things. I don't really understand the truth. So the first step in his method is to kind of recognize that we have these beliefs and to just sort of take a step back on these beliefs, not really to kind of reject them, but to take a step back to doubt the truth that we think we have but are unsure of, so that we can come back to these beliefs with a more certain method and then affirm the truth and falsity of them. Okay? The next step is that of analysis, which we saw in our first lesson. And that's to take, this should be the complex to the simple, it's to take the complex and to break it down into the simple. So we can take the example of a question such as, well, what's the meaning of life? It's a question which we're going to be looking at later when we read Viktor Frankl, A Man's Search for Meaning. And we can say, well, what's the meaning of life? Well, you see, it seems like a simple question, but it's in fact very complex. And you can break it down and say, well, there are various things that seem to make life meaningful. For example, my family, good health, happiness, beliefs, my religion, for example, the social practices, living in a good state, justice, etc. You see? So the idea of analysis would be to identify all those parts and to separate them, and then to start thinking about those parts on their own. Remember, this is kind of the process of humanistic thinking. Now, the third step then is to proceed logically from the known to the unknown. So what we would then do is to take each of these parts and to think rationally about how the parts, okay, are true or false, and how they relate to the whole, so that we get a whole system of thinking. So, for example, I might think, well, there are some social practices which I hold to be true. For example, that I shouldn't steal. And you can ask the question, well, why do I have that belief, and how does that contribute to meaning in life? And then you can start to think about how that affects your behavior. For example, if you were to steal, you'd be afraid of going to jail. You might have a bad conscience as a result, you see. And so all of that type of reasoning process then can then lead you to a deeper understanding and truth about this one aspect. And so you would want to then analyze all of these different ideas floating around your head about meaningfulness, which is a long process, you have to admit. But still, it's something that we should kind of do, is think through these processes to come at the truth of these matters. So, and the last part is that we need to ensure that our knowledge of the subject, okay, of the parts, okay, that we've now exposed and brought into a cohesive whole, is general and complete as possible. So by that, what he means is that if we find some part that contradicts the whole, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what's the problem there? And we might have to revise our entire system because it seems that an error has exposed, or we might find that the part itself can be resolved. And so this is what he means by systematicity, to ensure kind of a logically consistent and systematic whole, so that our knowledge of the whole is as complete as possible. Right? So let's get into the meditations itself. Now, Descartes starts the meditation by talking about this process of thinking. And he starts by talking about his beliefs in youth. Okay, so, and we can ask ourselves, when we're young, what kind of beliefs did we have that now that we're older we realize were kind of silly and false? So obviously we can point out such things as Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny, right? Well, obviously those things are false. But as we get older, we can talk about more fundamental things. So, for example, maybe when we were young, we thought that all old people were nice, right? Well, maybe that's not so true. Or we thought everybody likes us, and then we find out, well, Not everybody's going to like us no matter what we do, you see. So these are kind of beliefs about the world, about people that we start to realize are false. And of course, as we get older, we can start to see other beliefs about reality, about ourself, that we begin to realize, well, these things are not as true as I thought. And so the first layer of doubt, then, of suspending judgment, is to suspend judgment about those beliefs that we hold in our youth, and also about beliefs about the physical world around us, okay? So if we look at, for example, physical things that we see around us, we can say, well, it's often the case that our senses deceive us, right? So I might see a stick and maybe it's bent in water, and I can think, well, the stick is bent, and I pull it out, and nope, it's actually straight. Or I can be walking down the hall one time and I see someone, I say, oh, it's James, and I wave, and I realize, oops, nope, that's not James, and you kind of draw your hand away real quickly, feeling silly. And so notice how that our senses are kind of deceiving us, and this leads to this kind of doubt about the reality of the world around us, right? Well, another layer of doubt involves the physical body itself and the world around us as a whole. Okay, so, and one example is that of dreams. So, the odd thing about dreams, it's a very odd thing that you really have to think about, is the fact that it's not so much that you're dreaming and you wake up and you realize, oh boy, that was a dream. For example, if you had a really bad dream, you might wake up and realize, what a terrible dream. Thank God I was dreaming. But what about the fact that when you're dreaming, you act and you abide and you do things within your dream as though it were real? So that means that when you're dreaming, you don't know that you're in a dream world, right? So you can then transfer that back to the present moment. In a way, it could be the case that we're dreaming right now, just as we're dreaming when we are asleep, okay? But somehow we're kind of in a waking dream. And notice that in dreams as well, everything that occurs in our waking reality is kind of the same as in our dream reality. So, for example, I have a body in my dream world. I see things, I feel things, I can even feel pain. I can hear things and hear music. I see objects, I can smell things, I can eat things, etc. So how do I know the difference? Well, you can say, well, I know when I'm awake and asleep, but how do you know now that you're truly awake? How do you know that the world that you experience now and see is truly the world that is real, okay? The true waking world. What if there's a waking world beyond even this world, okay? And so this is that second layer of doubt. It starts that Descartes addresses, and he says, well, maybe we're not really as awake as we think. Maybe this world is a deception, okay? And the third layer of doubt is the doubt of self-evidence. So let's take a simple example. As I'm speaking, I'm kind of aware of the fact that I'm speaking, right? Well, how do I know that, okay? Or you can say, well, 2 plus 2 is 4. You say, well, that's true. That's definitely true. But how do you know that's true, okay? Well, every time I think about it, 2 plus 2 is 4, I recognize it's true. But as soon as I stop thinking about it, okay, it becomes a little doubtful. Maybe it could not be true. Maybe there's a case in which it's not. And what Descartes thinks up is the notion of an evil genius, this kind of godlike evil figure. This kind of gets him in trouble with authorities at the time because they say, you are thinking up alternative gods. Okay? And Descartes gets a little nervous because Galileo at the time is sitting in this tower for his own deeds saying, okay? And Descartes doesn't want to end up in trouble or in jail as well. So he retracts this a bit later, but anyhow, in his early text he says, well, this evil genius could deceive you about these truths. It could make you think that 2 plus 2 is 4 when in fact it's not, okay? Or at least it can make you doubt that you did know the truth, because maybe you did, but how do you know? Well, I have to look again, and then I forget, and then the evil genius maybe deceives me again. All right? So that's the first meditation. Now let's go into the second meditation, and before we do so, we're going to watch a little video.
wanted to know what the matrix is, Trinity.
This video is from an old film called The Matrix. And basically it's going to be considering the question, well, what is real? What is reality? How do we know we're truly awake?
Try to relax. This will feel weird. This is the construct. It's our loading program. We can load anything from clothing to equipment, weapons, training simulations, anything we need. Right now, we're inside a computer program. Is it really so hard to believe? Your clothes are different, the plugs in your arms and head are gone. Your hair has changed. Your appearance now is what we call residual self-image. It is the mental projection of your digital self. This is what is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain. This is the world that you know. The world as it was at the end of the 20th century. It exists now only as part of a neural interactive simulation that we call the Matrix. You've been living in a dream world, Neo. This is the world as it exists today. Welcome to the desert of the real.
Okay, so you see that little clip there gives us a kind of introduction to the idea within a kind of more modern context of computer information science of the fact that, well, maybe the world we see is just this kind of digital world and we're being deceived and we're not really seeing the world. So now that we've gone through all these layers of doubt, we're left with, it seems, nothing. It seems that, well, we can doubt everything, the truth of everything. We can even doubt the existence of God because, well, it's not self-evident that God exists, for otherwise everyone would be certain that God exists, just as we're certain that 2 + 2 is 4. So what can we be certain of? And this is what leads Descartes in the second meditation to the self. So following doubt, Descartes looks even deeper and he finds this one indubitable truth, one truth that can't be doubted. So everything else is doubtful, right? But what about the self? What about the I? Can I doubt my own existence? Okay, so, and you can think about this. You can ask yourself, well, how do I know that I exist? Maybe there's an evil genius which is deceiving me so that I only think that I exist, right? But here's the problem which Descartes recognizes, that if the evil genius is deceiving me, then it's still the case that something is being deceived. So that even if I am deceived, well, the deception is something, and the deception is still for me. Why? Because I'm the one being deceived. So it seems like in order to deceive, there must be something there to be deceived. At the same time, I can say, well, what if I don't exist? Maybe I don't exist, but wait a minute. I'm the one asking the question. I'm saying, I don't think I exist. And that seems to be a contradiction. In other words, my act whereby I doubt contradicts the doubt itself, so that I can say, I don't exist, right? But there's a contradiction there, And the contradiction there is that the statement contradicts the fact I don't exist, contradicts the fact that I'm the one saying that I don't exist. And from this, Descartes concludes, and this leads to his famous dictum, his famous saying, I think, therefore I am. And he says in Latin, dubito ergo cogito, cogito ergo sum. I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. There's a saying that goes back all the way to into the ancient times from St. Augustine, where he says, si fallor sum. In other words, if I'm deceived, right, if something's deceiving me, then I must exist to be deceived. And so Descartes is kind of drawing from that and bringing it into a newer Enlightenment context. Okay? So this leads to the third meditation. Remember, this is just a summary. You're going to want to make sure that you go through this text on your own. And we're only going to be reading the first 4 meditations. You could read the last 2 because they're very interesting and it leads into a proof of the existence of the soul, which could be interesting for you, but we'll only be doing the first 4. So following discovery of the self, Descartes then examines the nature of his experience. Now remember, in the first meditation, he doubted everything. And so the world, God, his body even, other people, he doesn't know if they exist. All he knows is that, well, I exist. Okay, but he can't just be stuck in himself. That would be what's called solipsism, from the word ipse, which means the self. And solipsism is a kind of philosophical position where we're kind of stuck only with the truth that I exist. So how do we get out of that? Well, let's imagine we're kind of in that matrix right now, and we're just in this white room and there's nothing else there. All we have is ourselves. Maybe even our body isn't there, but we just have consciousness, right? Suddenly we can start to think of things. We can think of a house, we can think of a fairy, we can think of the fact that we're thinking, right? We can think of the fact that 2 + 2 seems evidently 4, right? Well, we have these ideas, and these ideas seem to be different. And so what does Descartes do? He applies the method of analysis again to figure out what types of ideas we actually do have, and he discovers 3 types. And he says the first type is what he calls an adventitious or sensible ideas. So some ideas I have seem to apply to things that refer to objects of sense, like a tree, a car, a house, a mountain, the sun, stars, other people, right? And so he calls these ideas sensible or adventitious ideas. Other ideas, he says, however, seem to be the product of my imagination. So I can think of a person who's 100 feet tall. I can think of a bug which is as large as the moon, right? I can think of a purple elephant stampeding through the house. And these he calls fictitious or imaginary. And finally, he says there's these ideas which seem to be there before I think. Ideas which kind of are part, we could say part of what it means for me to think. So for example, as I'm thinking, I realize that I'm thinking, right? I realize I can hope for something, I can doubt for something, I can know the truth of something, right? The fact that 2 + 2 is 4. I can doubt the truth of something. For example, I can doubt the fact that I'm 10 feet tall. And it seems like this doubt and this certainty and this evidence and this recognition of myself as thinking, this is also a type of knowledge, and he calls these innate ideas. And then he begins to think, and he says, wait a minute, I have this one very strange idea. And so he calls, and of course it's this idea of God. But what is this idea, right? And so when he starts to ask this question, this leads him to a proof of God's existence, right? So first of all, we have to ask, when we think about God, what do we mean by God? Now, in the tradition of philosophy, there are specific notions tied to God, okay? And these notions are that God is something like the perfect being. So if we examine everything else that exists, we see that somehow it has certain flaws, okay? It's not quite perfect, okay? But God, in his essence, in his nature, in what he is, according to this tradition, is perfect. So he's also eternal. He's infinite. He's omniscient. He's omnipotent. He's all, etc. So that means he's all-knowing, he's all-powerful, and these are what's called predicates of God. In other words, they're attributes or characteristics of God. So just as there's a characteristic of me, for example, is to be brown-haired and brown eyes and to have reason, a characteristic of God is to be eternal, infinite, omniscient, and perfect. Okay? So this leads to a proof. So think about it. You can doubt everything, right? But you can realize that you exist. And then you can say, well, I have all these different ideas, and one is of this entity, this thing, this object, which I call God, which is also this perfect entity, this perfect being. Where did that idea come from? Okay? You could say, well, someone taught me the idea, but where did they get it from? Okay? And that's where he gets his proof of God's existence. He's going to say, well, no one got it from no one but God, right? And so here's the proof. I have an idea of an eternal, infinite, omniscient, omnipotent, etc. being, which I call God. Now, certainly I'm not God, right? I don't think any of you are God, nor is anything physical in this world God. For example, the trees are not God, right? The mountains are not God. The sun is not God. Why? Because the sun is not eternal and infinite and omniscient, right? You could say, well, what about the infinite? Maybe it's a mathematical term. Yes, but the infinite that we know of, okay, is different, because you can talk about the infinite and you can separate it from something like the indefinite. For example, if you stand outside at night and look into space, you can say, well, I'm looking at infinity. But you're not. Actually, what you're looking at is a stretch of space that just extends and extends and extends and tries to reach infinity but never does. See? So you don't actually see infinity. Or you can think of time and say the seconds are going on and they're approaching infinity, so I know infinity. And it's mathematical. But then you could say, wait a minute, no, you don't know infinity. All you know is that the seconds, or counting 1, 2, 3, 4, is approaching 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., but you never actually know infinity. Somehow God is the infinite, and all we know of is really the indefinite, this numbers counting. Anyhow, so I'm not God, and nothing physical is God. Okay, then something else must have put this idea in me. Why? Because where did I get it from? If it's not in the world, I didn't experience it. It's not something that I thought up. Why? Because, well, I don't create infinity. Rather, I need infinity in order to think. Just as I need infinity in order to perceive, to understand that the universe stretches to infinity, means that infinity must already be there in my head somehow. So what put it in me? Well, only something as powerful as the infinite could put the idea of infinity in me. But such a thing is God. So it must be the case that having this idea of the infinite and the omnipotent in me, only something as powerful as that could put it in me. So such a thing, which is infinite, etc., must then exist to put it in my head. And so that thing is God, and so this means that God must exist. Okay? So, this is an interesting proof. I'm not sure how convincing it is. It's convincing in some ways in a certain context. What I want you to do is to think about this proof on your own and ask yourself, what's convincing about it? What are some of its problems? So this is a very important notion for our class. And the reason is that when you look at the humanities, you see, what is Descartes doing here? He's giving us a proof of the existence of God by using reasoning. And so he's kind of giving us a proof which is more like a formal science. So notice how the proof here kind of imitates something like a proof you'd see in mathematics and logic. Well, the problem is that it's not a proof which is mathematical or logical in the same way. It's a philosophical proof. So it doesn't hold the same weight, which means that to be convinced about this proof, something more than just logical mathematical reasoning must convince us. And so what's going to convince us ultimately? Ultimately, well, the humanistic tradition is going to say that what's going to convince us is our whole world view about reality. And to have that, well, we have to look to something like science, mathematics, but also history, art, our own experience. All of these things are going to come into play so that in the end we're going to say, well, this is convincing or this is not. We'll have the opportunity to talk about this a bit more as we move into something like interpretation. So now we get into meditation 4, which is the last meditation we'll be looking at for this lecture. And we have the question, so we've established the existence of God, at least Descartes has, right? Now we have to ask, well, is God a deceiver? And he asked this question because he's already thought, well, it's possible that there's this evil genius deceiving me. Is that evil genius God? Right? And here he gives an argument against this view, which I'll just kind of talk out and then you can read it. And so the argument is this. Look, God exists and God is a perfect being, right? What would it mean for God to deceive? It would mean that somehow, for some reason, God feels a need to do something false, right? But why would God feel the need to do something false? In fact, for God to do that, it seems that it would be contrary to his nature, because part of the nature, the predicates, the characteristics of God, is to be good. And so it would seem strange for a good God to have a need to deceive, to do something false and evil. Therefore, it seems that God can't be a deceiver because to do so would be contrary to his nature. So just to recite the argument itself, we have what is more perfect cannot arise from what is less perfect. To deceive is less perfect than not to deceive, since deception implies malice and feebleness and therefore lacks power. If God deceives me, then somehow he is imperfect, and my idea of God would therefore be more imperfect than God himself, which cannot be the case, because God is perfect, and so therefore God does not deceive me. I think this is a very interesting argument that actually finds a lot of historical roots in the history of philosophy that Descartes is drawing on here. Okay, and for the last point, we have then the problem of evil. If God, the creator of the world, is not the cause of evil or error, then who is? There's obvious evil in the world, right? We can just turn on the news and watch, and it's terrible to watch, right? But what's the cause of that evil? I think everybody can kind of answer that question, and Descartes is going to give the answer, which I think is intuitively in your minds. The cause of evil is human beings. But how is that the case? And Descartes gives a kind of explanation here. He says, as thinking thing, as thinking person, right, we all have two basic intellectual powers, okay, and volitional powers. We have first free choice, so we can choose between A and B, I'll go outside or not, okay, which is called liberum arbitrium, of the will, the voluntas, okay, like volition, voluntas. So we have free choice, and we have our understanding, our intellectual capacities, the intellectus, by which ideas are apprehended or understood. So we have two things here. We have our choices, and we have our knowledge based upon our choices. Well, this is where he identifies the problem between the relationship there. Why? Because for our will, we can choose absolutely between two possibilities. So I can choose to hurt this person or not, right? And many times we're not aware of the full repercussions of our actions, and so we might choose to hurt someone without being truly aware of what we're doing. And according to Descartes, this lack of awareness, this limited understanding, coupled with absolute choice, is what results in evil. Now, it's an interesting solution. I think to some extent it holds weight, but at the same time, I think we can all also intuitively agree that it doesn't quite answer the problem of evil. It seems sometimes that there are people who want to hurt others. For example, in the case of malicious sadomasochistic individuals, Sigmund Freud, for example, talks about that. We can talk about that a bit later when we talk about psychotherapy and suffering. At the same time, it seems that, well, sometimes we just will things out of, for example, anger. Anger can stir us on, and maybe you can say, well, we're acting without thinking there, but also it's our passions do affect us. But still, what you see in Descartes here, notice this. It's an Enlightenment response to all of the problems of existence. So just in kind of summary form, why is it an Enlightenment response? Because for Descartes, he thinks that we can resolve all these problems through the authority and independence of reason. By thinking alone, we can answer the fundamental questions of existence. Okay, this is basic Enlightenment thinking, that the human being has the power to control and to understand their world. All right, so that kind of wraps it up for this lesson. Make sure you read Descartes, and if you need any extra help with understanding, you can always shoot me an email. Just make sure you explain whatever kinds of problems you have, and I'll email you back as soon as I'm able. So have a good day and good study.